It was that time of year where the clouds are so thick you can't tell if the sun's setting or not. Clara and I were out for a walk on the sands of our seaside town, conversing about nothing of much importance. Her dad had just left for Germany with the last of his funds, hoping for an occupation comfortable enough to start filling Clara's college fund again. I'd been focused on the sand and its polished stones, so Clara saw them before I did. "Hey, Mr. and Mrs. Friedman, good to see!" She trailed off, as if her attention had been stolen away by something. Indeed, the elderly couple stood just ahead of us, along with their nephew, Graham, and his dog, Ruby, I think. She was whining, but remained fixed on the shores, like everyone else. When I turned to look, I recoiled at the sight of something greyish-pink and absolutely colossal. My first thought was beached whale, and after absorbing the scene, it became clear that whatever had washed ashore was not a whale. It was the size of a blue whale in both length and span, though it seemed quite flat, relatively speaking. The rear of it was partially submerged in the murky olive tide. I'm not sure how long we stood there, gawking at this thing, but before long a crowd had amassed. It was quiet, aside from hushed murmurs. Nobody wanted to get close. We all remembered the time a whale actually had washed up 4 summers ago, and when a group of local fishermen went to secure pulleys around it, it had exploded a geyser of stinking gas and fluids. Soon after the dead creature had grown an audience, a team from the local environmental health department arrived. And yet, they too could do nothing other than gaze upon the thing. "Clara," I whispered, "we should go up to one of them, see if they've got any ideas." She nodded, and I set my eyes on a balding man wearing a pair of those photochromic prescription glasses, the kind that darkens in sunlight. We ambled our way over and settled beside him, returning our eyes to the scene. Clara spoke up before me. "So, what is that thing? Do you know?" He turned to us and just stared for a moment, lips parted slightly. With a huff, he glanced back at the creature, saying, "You want an honest answer, or something to make you feel cozy? Because I genuinely have no clue." "Oops, that was the honest answer. Sorry." "Really? Nothing at all?" I said. "Well, first thing that comes to mind is a starfish with those protrusions or arms, or whatever they are. Might be some kind of tube worm. But nothing this large has ever been observed, not in situ and not in fossils." It did look vaguely similar to a starfish, now that he said it. But he was right. Even the deep ocean and its giant this and colossal that paled in comparison to the great starfish. I snapped some photos and sent them to Clara, since her phone had run out. When my toes started to get cold, I decided it was probably time to leave, and Clara had no objections. We spent that afternoon over at my place, theorising about the starfish and watching TV. She stayed for dinner, a collaborative effort resulting in 2 steaming bowls of marinara spaghetti and meatballs. I, for one, was starving, but before I could land my fork in the bowl, I heard Clara clear her throat. Looking back up at her, I saw she had her hands clasped, eyebrows raised expectantly. "Oh, right. Grace. I'm sorry." Yeah, Clara was one of those quiet Christians, the kind you'd never know were religious unless you asked. I joined her in saying grace, for her sake over mine, and we tucked in. I offered her a ride home, but she insisted on walking. I couldn't blame her. The nights were getting longer, and she wanted to enjoy the last trailing vestiges of summer. When she left, I felt like treating myself to a bath. Even submerged in warm water, I couldn't shake the image of that thing. A starfish is the closest it could be equated to, and even then, it barely resembled one. It had bumps and ridges, leading me to believe it had bones. Starfish don't have bones. I woke the next morning, groggy and unrested. Clara had sent me some texts overnight, a lot of texts. Something about her urgency worked as a wake-up call for my brain, and I read over what she'd sent. "I went back out there. Don't know why, just had this feeling I couldn't shake. Made it to the handrail, the one running along the boardwalk, and I could see it from there. From higher up I got a better picture, like its shape and all. But someone was there. There was a man. He was curled up in front of it, or on it, and I don't know what he was doing. I saw the side of his face. He looked tired, or maybe afraid, I don't know. He had his head resting on one of the thing's limbs. I swear with the person next to them, they're like tree trunks. Huge trees. Freaked me out enough to leave. I replied, asking if she took any pictures, but she hadn't. The day was a bad one. I wasn't burnt out or anything, just one of those days the world seems to hate you. Except, it hated everyone. It was like a miasma had fallen across town, not quite visible, but real enough for its effects to manifest. 3 out of a family of 4 were killed in a T-bone collision with a bus. The traffic lights weren't working right at the intersection where it happened, despite them being perfectly fine the day before. Scott Davis's wheat fields on the edge of town got hit by what seemed to be a focused microcyclone, upturning the field so ferociously it looked more like a spent minefield afterwards. My car blew a gasket on the way to work. It stalled and jolted my coffee cup, spilling it on my phone. Moisture must have worked its way inside, because it wouldn't work after that, so I couldn't call anyone for help. To add insult to injury, when I went to buy rice to save my phone, the store was all out of it. They were out of rice. Clearly, I wasn't the only one to have noticed. Patrick, my cousin, messaged me in the afternoon, complaining about the day he'd been having. We talk frequently, so it was nothing out of the blue. I agreed, saying the same for myself. If I were to have a sudden change in faith, it was a perfect day to believe in the concept of fortune, and its counterpart. That said, it could just as easily have been a really bad day, nothing more. A light bulb lit up in my head, and I asked Pat if he was free in the evening. He said he was. I also asked if he'd actually seen the thing that washed ashore, and he said he hadn't. I told him he could go pick up Clara in his car and drive down to the beach. He thought it was a good idea, and so it was settled. 1 hour past dusk, Pat pulled by my house, and we drove over to Clara's. She seemed hesitant, but couldn't contain her curiosity. The want to know. It was a mutual feeling. We made the short drive to the beach, parking in the seafront car park and hopping out into the cold, seamless night. No one said much. All we wanted to talk about was the thing we were going to see, and we knew next to nothing about it. Clara led us to the spot she'd been the previous night. A looming mass of shadow rose across the dim horizon when we got close enough. Last night, the moon was a waxing gibbous, and though not yet full, it beamed bright enough to pierce the cloud cover. A gap in the clouds passed by the moon, casting cold light upon the starfish, and in tandem revealed a smaller, huddled figure. I thought Clara had been making shit up, but he was there all right. She said he'd looked tired or afraid. Neither of those quite fit. If I had to put a word to it, I'd say he was despairing. Just before the momentary lapse in cloud cover passed, the man turned his head to us. We recoiled in unison at seeing the sheer depth of pain in those eyes. Those swollen red eyes, wet with tears of unimaginable sadness, so deep and primal, I can't do it justice with words. It was a shock to see, but I can't explain Clara's reaction. The moment she saw his face, she let out a short yelp and slumped to her knees. A steady stream of tears ran over her hand, which was clasped over her mouth. "Clara, what's wrong? Are you okay?" The only reply I got was sobbing, and a repeated murmur of, "No, no, no." I glanced back a final time. The man had returned to his misery, coiled up against a dead limb. I gestured to Pat we should leave, something he'd already intended on doing, and we held each of Clara's arms on our shoulders. It was like she'd lost all muscle function. We practically carried her the whole way. She'd improved somewhat by the time we got back to hers, enough to be able to walk up her front path and go inside. Pat was afforded a slight nod as thanks, and then she was gone. We sat there for a moment, basking in the gloom she'd left behind. The lights in her house stayed off. Pat dropped me home after that. Even after seeing it, we still had no words aside from, "That was really weird." I should have stayed with Clara that night. Maybe if I had, things wouldn't have turned out the way they did. The next day lived up to the last in its cruelty. I don't want to get bogged down with the details. It was just a terrible day. After I got home from work and had dinner, I had the sudden urge to visit Clara. In fact, I cursed myself for not going sooner. I threw my bomber jacket on and went out to my car. I wanted to understand whatever she was going through, comfort her in whatever menial way I could. But when I arrived at her house, the driveway was empty. After seeing her in that state, there was only one place I could think she'd have gone. Lucky there's no speed cameras on the west road out of town, because I sped up it with near reckless abandon. I knew where she was. The one place she'd go to decompress, Bull's Head, named for the twin humps crowning the sea cliffs outside of town that looked vaguely like horns. Ask anyone in my town where they'd go for some time to think, and it would be Bull's Head. As I continued to drive uphill, the sky darkened. By the time I'd reached the tourist car park, night had fallen. The info booth sat dark and empty, but the parking lot had one resident, Clara's hatchback. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out. The sky that night was unnaturally clear, every pinprick star shining down, and with all the warmth lost to space, the air bit a chill into my skin. I stared up at that sky while walking up the path to Bull's Head. The moon looked off somehow. The longer I focused on it, the more its edges seemed to dissolve, leaking wisps so small I couldn't be sure if they were there at all. That momentary fixation was shattered when I noticed a figure standing near the cliff's edge. Clara. A pang of dread throttled my heart, and I bolted the rest of the way, fearing for the worst. But she kept still until I reached her. "Clara!" I wheezed. "What are you doing up here? You aren't going to do something stupid, are you?" When she turned to me, my stomach dropped. It looked like she'd tried putting on some makeup earlier that day, but now it had run with her tears into a sorry pastel mess. "It's all over, Peter. There's no point anymore." "That just isn't true. Your dad's out of country. At least give him a chance to save for your college fund. I know you, Clara. I see what you're passionate about, and if—" "No, not that. Not me. I'm talking about everything. Everything is over. Every life that's been lived and every one that would have been." I asked her to expand on that. Instead, she looked down, past the cliffs, off to the east, and pointed at something. I trailed an imaginary line from her finger, and what my eyes fell upon made my muscles freeze. The starfish, so enormous it could be seen from all the way up here, in the same place it had been since it washed ashore. It all came crashing down in that moment. From that vantage point, I could make out the starfish in its entirety. Its true shape. Those appendages. They weren't arms. They were fingers. Fingers attached to a palm, attached to a stumpy, shorn wrist. A hand. It was a hand. A hand of truly unimaginable vastness, laying palm up to the sky. Somehow, even from such a distance, I could see the strange man as well. And as if my gaze were a physical, perceptible thing, he rose to his feet and pivoted to look right at me. We made eye contact. I don't know how, but it was then I got the clearest picture of his face. Something once pure and beautiful, now a ship wrecked and rotted on a forgotten shoreline. He scrunched his face in a manner that said, "I'm so sorry." Then he turned away from me, towards the ocean, and began a slow march to the waters. I watched in shocked wonder as he reached those lapping waves, where he looked back to the hand one last time, and continued on into the sea. Only, his feet never broke the surface. He was walking across the water. A litany of Sunday school sessions flashed across my mind. My jaw dropped as the realization hit me. That hand, that vast Titan's hand, it was a right hand. And that man, gliding out across the ocean, in robes looking as ancient as the sorrow on his face, One particular verse rang out in my head. "I am, and you will see the Son of Man, seated at the right hand of power, and coming with the clouds of heaven. And peering up at the clear, cloudless night sky, I saw all at once the collapse of a grand design. A stifled sob shook me back to awareness. I spun on my heels, teetering far too close to the edge, and saw Clara stood facing its waiting moor. She met my eyes, but said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. Squeezing her eyelids tight, a fresh deluge of tears washed her cheeks. And then she stepped forward. She seemed to topple in slow motion. Time ground to a breathless halt. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything except watch as Clara plummeted down the 250-foot precipice. I let out a scream, and the heavens called back with a screeching, whistling wail. I saw the moon flicker, and when it returned, I was certain it had been melting the entire time. It spread into a nebula of all too quickly fading wisps. It blinked out again, but this time it didn't come back. The stars themselves followed. One by one they ceased to be, until all that remained was total, all-encompassing blackness. With my phone torch and my car's high beam, I managed to get back home, unscathed physically, but broken and ruined in every other aspect. It's been a day since the shadows fell. I'm at home right now, doing nothing. I don't know what thoughts to think. Whatever I should be feeling is something too extreme, too complex for the human brain, and consequently, I don't seem to feel anything. No warmth, no cold. Numbness. I checked the news earlier. Reports of the sky going dark from all across the globe. But it doesn't matter. Nothing does. How could it, in the face of the inevitable? Artificial lights started going out a few hours ago. My phone's display, the street lamps, even the flame on my stove burns without a flicker of light. The dark, it suffocated everything. Some time ago, maybe an hour, I heard rain start pattering on the window, so I went outside to let it wash over my face. I don't think it was rain. Not normal rain. Whatever it was felt too thick, too sticky, and the coppery stench it brought was enough to send me sprawling back inside. There was silence before. A hollow, ringing silence, the kind to hurt your ears with listening. Now, there are only screams. Some I recognize as neighbours, former acquaintances. Others don't sound remotely human. Whether one is of faith or not is a silly notion to ponder now. What good is having the choice when, ultimately, we're all locked into the same terrible fate? No one's left up there to save us. I don't know what killed him, but I have a feeling we're going to find out very, very soon.